goals and objectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Great.
what I'm hearing across the board thus far about the research and monitoring is that we definitely need to be better at explaining the methods and how often our groups are going out and how robust it actually is, because it's clear to me at least that that messaging isn't getting out to you guys and the right audiences. So I really appreciate all the comments so far on that. And then, yeah, Grant, if you want to, you've been patiently waiting with your hand up.
Hi, Grant Downey, Fort Bragg, California. I'm a commercial sea urchin diver and a commercial fisherman all around. Since Sarah just touched on the research clarification, one of my questions in that regards were the size of the MPA versus the size of the transects for the monitoring. What is that percentage? Are these transects randomized throughout that MPA, or are they only in the same area each time they are monitored? And with that said, has the whole MPA ever been monitored?
Okay, so that's you're in the right place with the right people, I think, to help answer those questions. So you may or may not know, and each MPA protects a number of different habitats, and each MPA that does get monitored, usually at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes there's many of those monitoring groups that are out there. So you can have many MPAs that have rocky intertidal monitoring in the tide pools, kelp forest monitoring. Mike happens to be our ROV kind of expert in monitoring kind of the deep mid-depth reefs where fish, or divers can't go. And then of course we have the hook and line surveys. So all of these types of monitoring are going on across, the network, and sort of depending on logistics and what habitats are there, each MPA has a varying amount of which habitats get covered. But the protocols for each habitat type do a fairly good job at covering as much area as possible in their given habitat. So they're not just going to one little tiny spot in the MPA. And then of course the protocols kind of depend on the questions you're asking scientifically. So we do have some transects that are randomized. We do have some transects that we go back and revisit time and time again because we want to get that snapshot in space. So I hope that kind of helps. I don't want to take up too much time talking about the monitoring. And then if Elizabeth and Mike have anything to add, please do.
Yeah, I just actually have a question, and I'm sorry, was it Grant that asked the question?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi, Grant. So I'm hearing that you're not alone in wondering kind of how the monitoring has progressed, how it's been done, how long it's occurred. And I'm wondering, just for the purposes of this decadal management report, this written report, kind of this, what's happened in the last 10 years that's going to be going to the commission, would it be helpful for you and kind of like your constituency, or your fellow fishermen, to see how would it be helpful, I guess, to see that information be represented? Would it be helpful in a summary of this is how monitoring has been done on a general approach? Because each different monitoring program has different protocols. So I think, Mike alluded to it earlier. We're right now reviewing reports. Put it in perspective, one of those reports is over 300 pages. So I'm going to assume that you may not want to read that. They will be included likely in their entirety as an appendix to the report. But is there some other way that you can get the information that you're asking from us that we can include in the report that would be helpful for you?
I think, like you stated, it would be a summary of each protocol. Like Sarah said, there's the deeper ROV and the hook and line studies. I never even had considered those being done in the MPA as a study. So just putting those out there, it's going to help everybody understand.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I could talk for a long time about these methods and I would love to, tell you what I know about them, but I don't think that's just probably not the place to do that. But I hear what you're asking, and the wheels are turning in my head about how we can go back a little bit and with these projects and do a good job of presenting the methods that you're asking about, not just the results, so that you can clearly see what that monitoring really is and how it's done. And sometimes that information with scientific reports gets buried in a citation that says, oh, we collected this data using such and such a method. See this paper from, 2001 or something like that. And, it's difficult to go track that information down. But I think that's a really critical piece to communicate. So thanks for that input. And that's definitely got me thinking on how to bring that out of our monitoring results.
And
I
Grant,
did have one.
Oh, go ahead.
I did have one more that pertained to the very first question, not so much the research idea of it, but what is a priority of what should be included. And I wasn't sure if there was a socioeconomic study done now that the 10 years has passed on loss of income or, loss of harvest commercially. You said there was a socioeconomic study done in the baseline period, but has there been anything else that, to the fishermen to find out what has been lost with the MPAs in place?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to follow Elizabeth's lead because we really want you to be asking you guys the questions. So I'm hearing, Grant, that it's a priority to really look at the economical impact on commercial fishermen and essentially not just the economics of it, but the actual catch as well, and potentially diversity of catch. Is that sort of what you're wondering about as a priority for us to look at?
Yeah, well, just I know, speaking as an urchin diver and going through log books in your area of where you work, how much harvest has been not on the market for the past 10 years because we weren't able to go into those areas. I don't know how to word it better.
Okay. No, I get it. I think.
Are you looking at like a shift or a loss of effort because the MPAs were put into place? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like
Yes,
you can't go. Okay.
What the loss of harvest was for the industry.
Okay. And
it would be by industry, obviously.
okay.
Whether it be, near shore fishing, the live fish market, the deeper near shore, urchin harvest, crab, everything.
Okay. And I would just also like to share that we got a comment from Anna, and I think this could actually go directly to what you're saying too, Grant. She suggested that an infographic or an image that shows each zone and what monitoring that has been done in that zone would be helpful, and also to include a list of groups that monitor each of those zones. So for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grant, that kind of goes back to what you were saying on how to present that summary of information on what has been done, kind of in an easy to follow manner.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure I have that.
Exactly. I'm going to be transiting, and I did just have a brief thing that I really wanted to input, and I didn't know when I would have the time. I didn't see it in one of those 4 questions.
So I would just say thank you so much for your input so far. We do only have 17 minutes left and would like to get to some of these other questions and other folks who have their hands raised. But I would welcome you to stick around, and at the end, we have some time for any other reflections that fall outside of these questions, if that sounds okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have to go, Grant, just reach out to us. We're here to chat anytime.
Yeah, no, I will. I'm going to try and stay on. I'm just going to be transiting. So.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I think at this time we should move on to the next question, if that sounds okay with my co-facilitators.
I just want to recognize that there's two hands up. Are they Mike and Vivian? I don't know if they're with this question or another question. And if it's with this question, if we can keep it succinct, I recommend that. Great.
Yeah, it's this question and I can.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so just in terms of the methodology, we have to understand it to buy into it. Just throw that comment out there. I mean, in modeling efforts elsewhere, without knowing the inputs, it's hard to describe the outputs and defend the outputs. So I'll leave it at that. And in terms of what Grant was just talking about, in terms of the economic impacts, we have to look beyond ex-vessel revenues. Ex-vessel revenues present such a small picture of the overall economic contribution of the commercial fisheries that we have to look at the downstream as well. So, I don't think there's a overarching multiplier that impacts commercial fishing revenue, but the ex-vessel revenue is easy to calculate. It's the downstream impacts that aren't.
Very quickly, there's another thing that's been lost that's hard to quantify, and that is the peace of mind when you're transiting through closed areas with fish on board, and the peace of mind that's been lost concerning, say, crab gear that travels into a closed area, and then you can't pick it up, and you're supposed to call the department and worry about whether you're going to get a ticket for that, or there's a lot more to worry about working around these closed areas on a big moving ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. That's a wonderful insight for us to hear. Okay, well, if there aren't any other comments, I can't see where we are, Avery, on the screen. Are we going to pose the question about?
Yeah, so I think the next question is right here. How would you define, measure, and/or assess progress toward the Marine Life Protection Act goals? So how do you define success in the MPAs?
Or outside? The network, covers the whole coast.
Mike Conroy, I know you have something to say. I see your hand. Why don't you?
Yeah, I sorry. I was just going to say, it would be nice if we knew what the MLPA's goals are. I know what they are, but it doesn't seem to me as if you're trying to retroactively make it seem like it's working. But you look at the 5 goals, right? And I'm sure, I think you can argue that some of them are being met depending upon how you define each goal, but I could make an argument that none of the 5 goals are being met.
So
but that's just me.
No, that's great, Mike. And I think there's some nuances sometimes about how we communicate that, because we're certainly not going into this review with this idea that it's just going to be all about the success. This is just about the progress. So if you don't think 5 of those goals are being met, we want to hear from you and as to why. So it's about the progress and not necessarily the success.
Yeah,
Well, it's also define and measure. It's not just progress, it's define, measure, and/or assess progress. So, the MLPA had 5 goals, and whether or not they're being met or even there's progress to them being met, I think is up for debate.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we have not communicated very well in this session tonight is that the terminology we use actually is performance. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking at whether something was successful or not. It means how things are measured against those goals. And so it may come out looking a lot of either we can't tell, or it may come out as, yeah, this one's not successful at all. So
no, you're 1,000%, Mike, 1,000% correct, Mike. You could ask 8 different sectors to define what the goals are, and you get 8 different answers. Mm-hmm. And and we see this all over the place. Until we have a common understanding of what we're striving for, it's going to be open to interpretation, and folks are going to interpret it in their own way. It's the more we can better define what these goals are and state them in a form that's not debatable, for the lack of a better word, then we'll be able to properly measure them. But, you know, like I said, they're so wishy-washy, so opaque, so open to interpretation that you could have one person say, oh, they're all being met with wholehearted success, and one person say they're being failed at meeting success, and they're both right.
So Mike, do you see a way that we could address that in this report? Like, other than just simply refer back to the 6 goals? Or do you not, like, is that kind of beyond what you're thinking about?
No, Elizabeth, I think that's a great point. You know, unless and until we get common language, then we open it up to, you know, common arguments, right?
Yep.
You need to have that baseline commonality. I mean, you remember the bycatch work group.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of common language.
You know, so to the extent that we can deal with that and describe it, then it heads off arguments in the future. Like if 10 years ago, we had to, for under each goal, define what that meant, then we wouldn't be sitting here saying one group can say it's wholeheartedly successful, another one saying it's complete failure.
Okay, so do you think, like, if we included that, like, excerpts of that report that Steve Wirtz referenced earlier in the evening, where the OPC Science Advisory Team kind of looked at some of those definitions, would that be helpful to include in the context of looking at the goals?
It would be helpful
okay.
as a top starting point, but not an end point.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
you need to reach out to the various sectors and, you know, maybe frame the 4 questions that were planned for tonight, frame them a little bit differently so that we can get some commonality in terms of term usage.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, that's great, Mike, because I think we do have plenty of room to set up the goals in the context of what we're talking about today with everybody and our stakeholders and moving forward for the review.
Yeah.
So.
And understanding that what we're facing is today between 30 by 30 wind and all the other things is vastly different than it was 10 years ago. You know, it's not, you know, it's an apples and oranges comparison.
George, I see you patiently have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna, you know, Mike's obviously a smarter fellow than I am and understands the intricacies of how this is working and stuff. But, you know, I don't know the 5 rules or 5 goals offhand. But, you know, from a fisherman's aspect and point of view, which I think I could reflect here, you know, to show, or, you know, for us to deem success or not, you know, is when we get opportunity back. Mike just mentioned multiple, you know, 30 by 30 MPAs. You know, there's all kinds of opportunity taken away. Offshore wind development coming, you know what I mean, in the North Coast. There's a lot of, you know, potential opportunity losses. You know, and it would be nice if at some point, sometime, opportunity was returned in a success story, right? I mean, if these protected areas, you know, serve their goal and, you know, replenish to the point to where, you know, access could be gained back, it would be a success in the fishermen's eyes, you know, and our, you know, for us giving up the opportunity to be able to go there and access that area and the resource in that area, you know, if it came full circle into the success story of getting access back because it works so well, is a great angle, but it takes access getting back. And, you know, I guess, you know, like I said, my way to deem, you know, success is, you know, if we could achieve access again, but then also, you know, if we can't because of, you know, structural ecosystem or something, then, you know, not the fish sorts. You know, if the surrounding areas, like the guy on here before said, you know, if those surrounding areas are performing better than before, you know, I mean, if we could show some way, you know, how it is working to give, more access to, the user groups.
So what I hear you saying is demonstrable positive effects to you as a commercial fisherman.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were one of the main user groups that, had access taken away, right? And in the process of doing that, a lot of us, look at it through conservation and our futures and try to understand the process that, we are preserving to ensure a future, right? Part of that and part of review of that process is understanding if it's working or not. Is it looking like the future is better because of what we've given up to preserve the future? And if we can't show that, or if it shows that it's actually going the wrong direction, then we need to assess it and maybe rethink the plan.
I totally agree with you.
And George, I think that would be a great opportunity for us, again, to really look at the linkages between the ecological side and the human side and better link that in the report. Because, right, a lot of times we silo them. So I love that comment because it sounds to me like, at least what I'm hearing from you is that the science and the data is important, but acknowledging what you guys have given up, for us to collect that science and look at the effects is going to be a really important part of the story.
The science and the data is obviously, I think, as important, right? If it's collected properly and collected in a strategic approach, then we know that it isn't sporadic. Like my comment earlier, if we just go in there willy-nilly and do one study one year, another study a different year in a different way or different time in the month, it isn't going to ever show anything consistent, right? Because we're not being consistent in our study and data gathering. I'm assuming anyways that, you guys are aware of the ocean conditions and how fish, how currents and how temperatures and everything change seasonally, right? We're aware of it because we are there every day and 280 days or something at least out of the year myself. If you go to try to, data collect in a given period when, conditions are different than the next time you go back, trying to look to see if, conditions have improved, it literally could be the conditions of the ocean have changed. Or if you go back at the same time next year, you could find something totally different. And I guess my point is, right, and maybe you guys are already doing it and probably aware of it, but if there's a strategic approach to the scientific and data collection year in and year out, then we're going to be able to really quantify how it's working. If we can't get a strategic data set, then it's never going to be able to show anything.
So, George, can I just thank you for your comment? I think we're all in agreement that that's a really valuable perspective. And I would also like to recognize that we have 4 minutes left in our breakout room. And at least from my perspective, what I'm hearing you say is a natural segue into our last question, which is, and I don't have the wording, oh, right there it is. What role would you like your community to play in the MPA management program? So, there are opportunities in other projects where people can help collect data. Is something like that worthwhile for your community, or do you see your community playing a different role in the MPA management program?
Well,
and that's open for anyone too.
Go ahead, George.
Well, I would just say, here locally for Crescent City, right, in our local, Fishermen's Association, first off, we're not scientists, we're fishermen. I don't know one of the guys down there that maybe they have, some science background or something, but, that being said, the potentials I think are endless if the communication is there. To this point, I don't know of communication that have led to the potential of fishermen gathering the scientific data. And I don't even know if, how that would work out. But that being said, I think that from what we've heard here today, there's obviously you guys are working up a report that is going to go back to the commission, but it seems as though there's potentially the need for a side report to clear up, what has been, what data and science has been achieved, what point for each of these MPAs are we on, the success or not, given, when they were formed, what they were trying to achieve. And, I guess this isn't answering your question on what role the community would like to play in it, but, I think
Well,
to
I
have,
think that we have the basic gist, and I do see that both Ken Bates and Mike Conroy have comment, and we have about 2 minutes left. Would you be willing to let either one of them kind of add on to what you've provided?
sure, I'll punt the ball.
Great, thank you.
Mine's
And
Let's hear from Ken, because I don't think he's spoken up yet.
easy, meaningful. Okay, Roger.
Okay, Ken, I'm asking you to unmute. Thanks, Mike. Ken, are you getting? Oh, there you go.
All right, thank you. Ken Bates here, Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association. I have to say, I'm going to whine for a minute or two. I've heard a number of times tonight, and I've heard this stuff for the last 20 years when we talk to Fish and Game and other scientific outfits, they all talk about how they want to gather our data. Fishermen's data is considered anecdotal, and for the most part, it doesn't carry any weight whatsoever. I've run into this again and again and again. Your question about when, how would you like to see your community, being involved in the management? Well, that's a question that we could have asked 10 years ago, it's the same thing. And these things are really problematic. As you probably know, or you may not know, right now, 3 fishermen's associations in Northern California are doing mapping of fishing grounds up here. And this is in part to try to have some sort of a snapshot in time, a baseline of where guys have been fishing, and at this present time, with the idea that A, it could be used for climate change, evaluations, and B, it could also be used to see, where things are getting caught or have been caught in the past, and how this is going to affect where they're going to site these wind power projects. And there was tremendous kickback about fishermen doing their own mapping, even though the mapping is technically peer reviewed. So I think that it's kind of maybe not the best